The heat of the late August sun was a physical weight on Alara's shoulders, as heavy as the stares from the crowd gathered in the dusty square of Harlan Creek. The cotton of her plain, gray dress felt coarse against her skin, a borrowed garment for a ceremony of shame. She stood on a hastily erected wooden platform before the courthouse, its stone steps worn smooth by generations of troubled souls. Below her, the faces of her neighbors blurred into a tapestry of pity, morbid curiosity, and, in a few unsettling corners, undisguised greed. Her gaze darted past them, searching for a familiar comfort that wasn't there. Her father, a man already hollowed out by grief and failure, was absent. She couldn't blame him. How could a father watch his own daughter be sold? Her younger brother, Caleb, stood near the back, his small frame rigid, his fists clenched at his sides. He was only 12, but the look in his eyes was one of a man witnessing an unbearable injustice. Sheriff Brody, a portly man whose uniform was too tight at the collar, cleared his throat, the sound amplified by the tense silence. He held up a sheaf of papers, the official seal of the county glinting in the sun. As per the Harlan Creek County Ordinance 7 billion, regarding the settlement of delinquent property taxes through familial indenture, he announced, his voice devoid of emotion, "We are here today to resolve the outstanding debt of the Miller family." He didn't need to elaborate. Everyone knew. They knew of the blight that had destroyed their crops 2 seasons running, of the long, expensive illness that had stolen Alara's mother and every last cent the family had. The debt was not extravagant, but to a family with nothing, it was a mountain. And Alara, at 18, was the price of that mountain. The concept was archaic, a cruel relic from a bygone era that the county council refused to abolish, citing tradition and fiscal responsibility. Indenture, a pretty word for slavery. The highest bidder would own her labor, her time, her life for a period of 5 years. 5 years. Alara's breath hitched. She focused on a crack in the wooden planks beneath her feet, trying to anchor herself. She saw old man Hemlock in the front row, his thin lips curved into a wet, predatory smile. He owned the largest farm in the next valley and had a reputation for working his hands to the bone. Her stomach churned with a cold, hard dread. She felt like a trapped bird, her wings beating uselessly against the bars of a cage built by poverty and misfortune. "The terms are for a period of 5 years, Sheriff Brody continued, his voice droning on. "The indenture contract is binding and absolute. We will begin the bidding at $500. A gasp rippled through the crowd. It was a paltry sum for a human life. A deep, profound humiliation washed over Alara, colder than any winter chill. This was her worth. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the first voice that would claim her. The air crackled. The $100 opening bid hung there, an insultingly low price for a human life. Before anyone else could even process it, a gravelly voice cut through the silence. 100, it rasped. It was Jedediah Hemlock. His small, beady eyes, sunk into a fleshy face, were fixed on Alara, a predatory grin spreading across his thin lips. A wave of nausea washed over her. Hemlock owned the largest plot of land bordering the forest, a man known for his cruelty and for working his hired hands to the bone. Whispers about what he did to the young women who cleaned his house were a dark staple of Harlan Creek gossip. 100 for Mr. Hemlock, Sheriff Brody announced, his voice booming. "Do I hear 150? A small, hesitant hand went up near the back. 120, mumbled Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, her face etched with pity. She couldn't afford more, but her gesture was one of kindness, a futile attempt to save Alara from the worst fate. 200, Hemlock barked immediately, his voice sharp, silencing any other charitable thoughts. He shot a venomous glare toward Mrs. Gable, who quickly lowered her eyes and shrank back into the crowd. The message was clear. This was his game. The price climbed in increments that felt like hammer blows to Alara's soul. 250, 300. Hemlock was the only one bidding now, his offers coming fast and aggressive, each one a declaration of ownership. The crowd watched, a captive audience to her humiliation. She could feel their stares, some filled with pity, others with a morbid curiosity. Her gaze darted to her little brother, Leo, his small face pale with fear, his knuckles white where he gripped the hand of a neighbor who'd offered to watch him. He looked so lost. The sight of him, so helpless, was a fresh stab of pain. This was for him, she reminded herself, to keep a roof over his head. $500, Hemlock bellowed, his chest puffed out. He was enjoying this, reveling in the power he held over her family. Sheriff Brody scanned the silent crowd. $500, a generous sum for 5 years of honest labor. His words felt like acid. Going once, Alara's breath hitched. Her vision began to tunnel. This was it. The world was shrinking to the leering face of Jedediah Hemlock. Going twice, she closed her eyes, bracing for the inevitable. A single tear escaped, tracing a cold path down her cheek. She imagined a life of servitude in that dark, isolated farmhouse, her spirit slowly being crushed under the weight of his depravity. Sold for $1,000. The voice was not loud, but it sliced through the tension with the clean authority of a sharpened blade. It came from the back of the crowd, a place of shadows near the old oak tree. Every head turned in unison. The silence that followed was absolute, heavier and more profound than before. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Alara's eyes snapped open. A man was stepping forward, parting the sea of onlookers. He was tall, with broad shoulders strained against a worn denim jacket. His face was weathered, carved by sun and hardship, and a thick, dark beard was dusted with gray. He wasn't from Harlan Creek. She'd never seen him before. His eyes, a startlingly clear gray, met hers for a brief, unreadable moment before shifting to the sheriff. He stood there, solid and unmovable, his presence alone a challenge to the entire proceeding. Hemlock sputtered, his face turning a blotchy red. "Who in the hell?" The stranger ignored him completely, his gaze locked on Sheriff Brody. "1,000, he repeated, his voice low and steady. "Cash." The stranger's words fell into the oppressive silence like stones into a still, murky pond. For a moment, no one moved. The $1,000 figure seemed impossible, a number from a different world than the one Harlan Creek inhabited. Sheriff Brody's jaw hung slightly ajar, his gaze shifting from the stranger to the wad of cash that now seemed to burn in the man's hand. Then the spell broke. Jedediah Hemlock's face, which had been a mask of smug satisfaction, contorted into a snarl of pure fury. "What is this? A joke?" he spat, his voice cracking. He pointed a trembling finger at the stranger. "Who in God's name are you? You can't just waltz in here." The stranger paid him no mind. His focus was entirely on the sheriff, his expression unreadable. With deliberate, heavy steps that echoed on the wooden platform, he closed the distance to the podium. He laid the 10 crisp $100 bills down on the weathered wood. The sight of the money, real and undeniable, sent a fresh wave of shock through the crowd. "This is an outrage, Brody." Hemlock bellowed, his face turning a blotchy red. "That's illegal money, has to be. I demand you reject this bid." Sheriff Brody, finally jolted from his stupor, held up a placating hand. The law, however unpleasant, was his domain. "Settle down, Jedediah," he said, his voice gaining a sliver of authority he hadn't possessed moments before. "The bid is legal. The cash is here. It's the highest offer." He looked at the stranger. "The indenture is yours, mister." Alara watched the entire exchange from her prison on the block, her body trembling so violently she feared she might collapse. The crushing terror of Hemlock's ownership was receding, but in its place rushed a cold, disorienting wave of uncertainty. She was saved from one monster, but who had saved her? This man was a complete unknown, a ghost who had solidified into flesh and bone before her very eyes. She studied him, searching for any clue. His hands were weathered and calloused, the hands of a man who worked the earth. His worn denim jacket and scuffed boots spoke of hardship, not wealth. Yet he carried himself with a quiet, unshakable gravity. Sheriff Brody slid the indenture papers across the podium. "You'll need to sign here. It legally transfers the Miller debt and the girl's 5-year term to you." The stranger picked up the offered pen. In the space for the indenture holder, he signed a single, stark name, A. Miller. He didn't look at Alara. He simply folded the document, tucked it securely into his inner jacket pocket, and turned. His eyes, a clear, piercing gray, finally met hers. They were devoid of the lecherous heat she'd seen in Hemlock's, but they held no warmth either. They were the eyes of a man looking at a problem that had just been solved, a piece of property that had been claimed. His voice was the same low, gravelly tone as before, carrying only the weight of an order. "Come." He turned and walked toward the edge of the square, not once looking back to see if she was following. He expected obedience. With a final, heartbreaking glance at her little brother's small, confused face in the crowd, Alara took a shaky breath, stepped down from the block, and followed the stranger who now owned her. Alara's worn leather shoes scuffed against the dusty ground as she followed the stranger's broad back. Each step away from the town square was a step into a void. The murmurs of the crowd faded behind them, replaced by the rhythmic crunch of gravel under their feet. She didn't dare look back. She could feel Jedediah Hemlock's furious glare burning into her, a final, possessive brand she was desperate to escape. The man ahead of her, this A. Miller, walked with a purpose that left no room for hesitation. He never once looked over his shoulder to see if she was following. He simply knew she would be. Her mind was a whirlwind of frantic questions. Who was he? The surname Miller was a cruel coincidence, a phantom connection to a family she barely had. Her father, a man broken by debt and grief, had never spoken of distant relatives. Had he sent this man? The thought was a flicker of hope, but it died as quickly as it came. There was nothing paternal in the stranger's rigid posture or the cold finality of his purchase. He had bought her like property, his $1,000 a heavier chain than any iron shackle. They reached the edge of town, where the dirt roads gave way to cracked asphalt leading out of Harlan Creek County. Parked under the shade of a lonely oak was a pickup truck that looked as weary as the landscape. It was an old Ford, its blue paint faded to a chalky gray and scarred with rust. A significant dent marred the passenger side door, a testament to a hard life. He walked to the passenger side, pulled the stiff handle, and swung the door open for her. It wasn't a gesture of courtesy. It was a silent, indisputable command. Alara climbed in, the vinyl seat cold against her skin despite the day's oppressive heat. He circled the front of the truck, his heavy boots loud on the pavement, and settled into the driver's seat. The cab smelled of oil, dust, and something faintly metallic, like old tools. He turned the key, and the engine roared to life with a shudder that vibrated through Alara's bones. Without a word, he pulled onto the road, leaving the town of her birth shrinking in the rearview mirror until it was gone completely. The silence inside the truck was suffocating. She stared out the window, watching the familiar pines and rundown farmhouses give way to denser, unfamiliar woods. She risked a glance at him. His hands, calloused and steady, gripped the steering wheel. His jaw was set, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He seemed carved from the same unforgiving rock as the Appalachian Mountains surrounding them. Just as she thought she might scream from the tension, he spoke, his voice a low rumble that was more felt than heard. "Seatbelt." It was one word, not a request, an order. Her fingers fumbled as she pulled the strap across her chest and clicked it into place. Minutes stretched into an eternity. He eventually turned off the paved road onto a hidden, unpaved track that plunged deep into the forest. The trees closed in, their branches scraping against the sides of the truck. Finally, in a small clearing, a cabin came into view. It was small and weathered, but a thin curl of smoke rose from its stone chimney. He killed the engine. The sudden silence was absolute, broken only by the sound of her own frantic heartbeat. This was it. This was her new home. The key scraped in the lock, a loud, metallic sound in the profound quiet of the woods. A. Miller pushed the door open and stepped inside, not looking back to see if she was following. Alara hesitated for only a second before crossing the threshold, her worn boots silent on the wooden porch. The air inside was cool and smelled of pine, wood smoke, and something else, cleanliness. It was a single, large room, and her eyes darted around, taking in every detail. In one corner sat a pot-bellied stove, cold but swept clean of ash. A simple wooden table with 2 chairs stood in the center. Against the far wall was a neatly made bed, and in the opposite corner, a small cot with a thin mattress and a single folded blanket. It was sparse, almost monastic, but the floor was swept, and there were no layers of dust or grime. It was a world away from the cluttered, desperate poverty she had left behind. He broke the silence, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. "That corner is yours," he said, gesturing with his chin toward the cot. He didn't look at her. "There are more blankets in that chest if you need them." His gaze was fixed on the center of the room, as if she were merely a part of the new inventory. "Your duties are simple. You will cook. You will clean. You will keep the fire. When the ground is fit, you will tend the garden out back. You will earn your keep." The words were plain, devoid of malice, but stripped of any kindness. They were the terms of a contract. Elara could only manage a small, jerky nod, her throat too tight to form words. He seemed to accept this, turning toward the small kitchenette area. "There's a pot of venison stew from yesterday on the stove. Heat it. Find bowls in the cupboard. We will eat." With that, he moved to the table, sat down, and pulled a long hunting knife from a sheath on his belt. He produced a whetstone from his pocket and began to sharpen the blade with slow, deliberate strokes. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The sound filled the small cabin, methodical and unnerving. Elara felt a fresh wave of fear, but his instructions gave her a task, a focal point to distract from the terrifying reality of her situation. She moved toward the kitchenette on trembling legs. The cupboards were plain wood, but the handles were smooth from use. She opened one, finding a small, neat stack of tin plates and 2 bowls. Beside them, on a small shelf, were a few worn books. As she reached for the bowls, her frayed sleeve snagged on the corner of one of the books, dislodging a folded piece of paper that fluttered to the floor. She froze, glancing over her shoulder. He hadn't moved, his focus entirely on the knife's edge. Her heart hammering against her ribs, she bent down and snatched the paper. It was old, the creases soft and deep. She carefully unfolded it. It was a child's drawing, the colors faded. A stick figure of a tall man with a crudely drawn beard stood next to a woman with bright yellow crayon hair. Between them, they held the hands of a much smaller figure. Above them, a lopsided sun smiled down from the corner of the page. Elara stared at it, her breath catching in her throat. This place, this man, it was all harsh lines and cold silence. But this small drawing spoke of a life that was anything but. She quickly folded it and slipped it deep into her pocket just as he looked up. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, sharp and questioning, before he returned to his task. The stew, the cabin, her own fear, it all faded into the background, replaced by one burning question. Who was A. Miller? The official notice arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a reluctant deputy whose eyes wouldn't meet Thomas Miller's. The paper felt heavy in his hand, a final, damning judgment printed in stark black ink. It wasn't a surprise. The debt had shadowed their lives for years. A creeping rot that started after his wife's long illness consumed their savings and then their spirit. But seeing it codified, the date of the auction set, the cold legality of it all, shattered the last of his fragile denial. Harlan Creek County had its own harsh way of balancing its ledgers. He sat at the rickety kitchen table long after the deputy left, the notice lying flat between his calloused, trembling hands. The thin, gray light of the Appalachian autumn filtered through the grimy window, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Elara found him there when she came in from chopping the last of their firewood. She saw the paper, saw the utter defeat in her father's slumped shoulders, and her heart sank. She knew. "It's the final one, isn't it?" she asked, her voice quiet but steady. At 18, she had carried the weight of an adult for years, her youth worn away by worry. Thomas couldn't speak. He just nodded, a slow, jerky movement. He couldn't look at her, couldn't bear to see the reflection of his own failure in her tired, resolute eyes. That night, the silence in their small cabin was a physical presence. heavier than the threadbare blankets they used to ward off the encroaching chill. Her younger brother, Leo, slept soundly in the small adjoining room, blissfully unaware of the precipice on which their family stood. Later, her father finally spoke, his voice a raw whisper in the oppressive dark. "There's no other way, Alara. They'll take the house, they'll take everything. We'll be on the road with winter coming." He paused, and a sound like a choked sob escaped him. "Jedediah Hemlock, he offered to buy the debt. If you'd work for him, I told him no, I'd rather die." The words hung in the air, a testament to his love but also a confirmation of their utter helplessness. The auction was the only alternative. 5 years of servitude. It was a prison sentence for his poverty, and she was the one who would have to serve it. "I'll do it, Papa," she whispered back, the words tasting like ash. "I'll do it for you and Leo." On the morning of the auction, Alara woke to an unnerving quiet. The fire in the hearth was cold. Her father's cot was empty, the blanket folded with a stark neatness. On the table, where the county's notice had been, sat a small, carved bird, a whittling he'd made for her when she was a little girl, and a single, folded piece of paper. "I can't watch them take you. Forgive me." The shame had finally broken him. He was gone. A wave of desolation washed over Alara, colder than any winter wind, but it was quickly followed by a hard, steely resolve. He had left her to face this alone, but he had also left her in charge of what remained. She looked in on Leo, still sleeping, his small face peaceful. She would not fail him. Pulling on her worn coat, she stepped outside into the gray dawn, her face a mask of determination. She would not cry. She would walk to the town square and face what was coming. Morning light, thin and pale, filtered through the cabin's single window, painting stripes across the wooden floor. Alara had barely slept, the image of the man adding a log to the fire for her warmth replaying in her mind. It was a gesture of care, so at odds with his harsh silence. The faded drawing felt heavy in her pocket, a silent testament to a life she couldn't comprehend. When he finally stirred, the tension in the room was different, not of fear, but of a question hanging unanswered in the air. He sat at the small table, his back rigid, as she placed a tin plate of warmed beans and a mug of black coffee before him. Her hand trembled, but her resolve had hardened overnight. This silence could not continue. She took a deep breath, pulled the crinkled drawing from her pocket, and laid it on the table between them. "I found this yesterday," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He flinched as if struck. His eyes, which had so carefully avoided hers, now locked onto the childish depiction of a smiling family. "Who are you?" Alara pressed, a tear finally escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. "Why did you bring me here?" For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. The man's broad shoulders slumped, the intimidating posture of A. Miller dissolving before her eyes. When he looked up, his face was a ruin of pain and exhaustion. The mask was gone. It was him. It was her father. "Alara," he rasped, his voice gravelly and broken from disuse and sorrow. It was the voice that had read her stories, the voice she thought she'd never hear again. I couldn't face you. The shame of what I'd let happen, it was eating me alive." He explained everything in a torrent of words. He hadn't abandoned them. He had left for the coal fields in West Virginia, a desperate, dangerous gamble to earn cash fast enough to stop the auction. He'd worked grueling shifts, his body aching but his mind fixed on his family. He was going to send the money anonymously, but word reached him that the county had moved the date up. He drove for 2 straight days, arriving just as the bidding began. "I couldn't let Hemlock have you," Thomas Miller choked out, his own tears now falling freely. "And I couldn't stand on that square as Thomas Miller, the man who failed his family. So I became someone else, just long enough to bring you home." Alara stared, the world tilting and then righting itself. It was a terrible, desperate, prideful plan, and she understood it completely. She reached across the table and covered his calloused hand with her own. "Dad," she whispered, the word a key unlocking all the grief and fear she'd held inside. He squeezed her hand, a lifetime of apology in the gesture. Reaching into his coat, he pulled out the indenture contract. With a decisive rip, he tore it in 2, then in 4, and let the pieces fall to the floor. "You are not a servant, Alara," he said, his voice firm for the first time with purpose, not command. "You are my daughter. We're going to get Leo. We'll start over, right here, together." Alara looked from his tear-streaked face to the window, where the sun was now climbing over the Appalachian peaks, flooding their small cabin with a clean, hopeful light.